So. Là c'est en russe. Plein écran. Merci. Good morning, everybody. So thank you to be here. And so my name is Adam Ali. I'm a professor at the University of Montpellier. So I teach also. So I will give you some information about my research. I make this research in the Institute of Science and Evolution of Montpellier, but also I teach in the Department of Ecology and Biology and Evolution at the University of Montpellier. So I will talk about wildfire activity in boreal ecosystems, but mostly in Canadian boreal ecosystem because during I think that the last 10 years I deal with these ecosystems, and I will give you some part of my history. So initially I just want to work in paleoecology, but after I make an email to Yves Bergeron to say I'm a little bit interested to work in also fire and something like that, he told me, okay, I have some kind of funding, but just for 6 months. So you need to have more funding if you want to work in this topic. So we start to write some funding, we get succeed. We write another funding, we also succeed, and now we are here. So we decided to make this kind of network. The GDRI, it's a French tool that the main partner is the CNRS. It's a French tool. So it gives us not a lot of money, but just money to make network. And after we decided with Igor to build this network and to start also to get more funding with Belmont. So we get this funding, and now we want to get more because we are a little bit ambitious. That's why. So I will start with boreal ecosystems. A large biome shaped especially by wildfire. So this biome is very important in terms of forests, but also in terms of wildfire, because this wildfire is very big issues for people that live in this biome. So each year we have millions of hectares of forests that burn. And this issue is very important. You just see now in California that fire is really a big problem. Even if the president just say, people here do not manage correctly their forests. Little bit bad guys, I think so. So this picture just show you a big fire. A couple of years before, and this fire is the one worst fire season ever in the Northwest Territories. This fire is very big because we have 380 million of forest hectares was burned during this period, and it forced people in a small community from their homes. And this big fire is the main reason also that we start with Igor and Nina and also a student Dorian to go to this territory to see if this kind of fire activity occurred in the past. And we try to make also paleoecological study, but also dendrochronological study in order to put this exceptional year of fire in the context of climate changes, but also in the context of the past. So, wildfire is a big issue for governments seeking strategy to limit their impact. Consequence related to this fire is the loss of timber, private and public goods, cost associated to destruction of economic activities, and wildfire play a key role in Earth carbon cycle and represent a significant source of carbon to the atmosphere. Because when you have big fire, you put carbon in the atmosphere. And this carbon also play a key role in climate circulations. So normally, the main hypothesis is fire will contribute to the global warming. It's not a trivial point, because we have some people that say also that fire could also diminish the global warming with some kind of feedback with albedo, etc. So, but we can say that this disturbance play a key role in Earth carbon cycle and climate systems. I think that it's a challenge research, and the main point is we need to document wildfire activity at different temporal and spatial scale. Try to link this perturbation with climate oscillations in the context of climate changes. We need also to see the forest composition and species migration adaptations in regard to this issue, in regard to wildfire activity, and also to try to mitigate and to give some answer about management and sustainable forestry in this country that deal with these perturbations. So, in my part, I think that using paleoecology, this ecology of the past, to give us some information about the past fire activity and the main factors that play a key role in this fire activity could be a useful information for stakeholders. So, paleoecology, the ecology of the past, the main hypothesis is that species that we deal with they have the same ecology in the past. I think that's something very basic, but is the main point for when we deal with paleoecology. Also, in the past, we have main climate changes. So we can try to see these climate changes, to take the main point of these climate changes, and to see the impact on fire and vegetation dynamics. So the question, has fire activity changed in the past? Why? The drivers also changes. Climate, vegetation, human. So, the main way for me to track past fire activity in boreal ecosystem is to use lake deposit. It's a natural archives. You can have very stratified sedimentations. I prefer to go in the field during winter. Could be paradoxal when you when you see me. But I prefer to go during winter because during winter we have a stable platform. So we can walk, make some wall, test, and take sediments. Could be very cold. I think that with Pierre, we go in the east part of Quebec and you have minus 20, something like that. It's pretty cold. But stable platform to walk. But sometimes we also go during winter. For example, we go to the Northwest Territory, out of nowhere, no boats. We need to take helicopters. Quite good. So, you see, we make this kind of platform, and also we have a wall in the center, and we have some kind of design, the core to take sediment, like yesterday, the Russian core, but we have also designed to some material that allow us to take the sediments. In this natural archive, you can use several proxies. Macro remain, of plant macro remain, like this seed of betula. Gwen told you about chironomid that we can use to infer past climate. We can use pollen. The most important thing, we can use also charcoal particle. We can use also biochemistry analysis. It's not a new proxy, but a proxy that is not commonly used to also to infer the past variation in the forest composition, also to track the opening of the landscape. It's a PhD thesis that deal with this proxy in the eastern part of Quebec. The thesis of Carole Bastianelli. She tried to see when you have an opening of the boroilm landscape in the north part of Quebec, using this proxy. Also now you have people that push with DNA, using DNA from sediments in order to infer past vegetation, but also past animals close to the lake, new tools. But I never use it, but why not? So, when you want to reconstruct paleofire and vegetation's dynamics, so we have a lake, you take a core, you make chronology with C14 dating. We also use it to have the temporal dynamic of the paleofire and vegetation's oscillation through times. And mostly we use pollen grain to infer vegetation composition, but also with charcoal we can infer fire frequency, biomass burning, and also fire size. Fire size is a new tool that I developed using charcoal a couple of years ago. So I will show you some information about fire size also. So this map just show you the different sites that I deal with during this 10 years, last 10 years. Most sites is, you see, in Quebec, because I start Quebec in Canada also. Now we start with some study in Eurasia, notably next to, close to Balkai Lake, also in the Northwest Territory in Canada, but also in Scandinavia, with the PhD thesis of Gwen in Ural Mountain with the PhD thesis of Shema. So you can see that we have some part that we need to fill. Also in Canada, but also in Eurasia. So, from charcoal particle to fire history, what we are talking about in terms of spatial scale. It's very important to be sure that, for example, that fire that you are dealing with occur close to the lake that you study. So, during this long period, I tried to see and to give the spatial scale of this paleofire activity. to be sure that I deal with, for example, with a regional point of view or with a local point of view. So normally we have charcoal peaks influx corresponding to a piece of charcoal per centimeter cube and per year. And you know, this cross corresponds to the fire episode. Also, we can infer fire returning interval. So, in this graph, you can see a low period of fire activity, an increase of fire activity, and a decrease of fire activity. So, we told you that we need to be sure that the peak that we deal with corresponds to a local fire. This is a study developed by my student François a couple of years ago. And we are a little bit lucky because we make some trap of charcoal in the lake. And we just want to see the input of charcoal and pollen in the lake. And during this period, we have a big fire, a very big fire, the Eastman fire. And this fire burned a lot of hectares in this area, but it's very far from our study zone. And we take the trap, start to check charcoal inside, and we see that this fire puts more charcoal in the lake compared to a small fire that occurs very close to the study site. So, fire that occur very far from the lakeshore could put more charcoal compared to a fire that occur very close to the study site. So, initially some people say that the peak magnitude is a good proxy to infer the local fire activity. And with this study we say it's not a proxy to infer local fire activity. Local fire produce more large charcoal compared to regional fire. But you cannot use it as the peak magnitude, use it as a proxy to infer local fire events. Also, we try to match or not our peaks with dendrochronological study. And also, sometimes you can see that it's perfect. You know, the cross corresponds to the fire event inferred with charcoal, and the asterisk corresponds to fire events detected with dendrochronological analysis. But it's the best scenario, but it's not each time the case. And that you need to keep in mind that the peak could correspond to one or several fire episodes. That's why it's very hard to say that I have said yesterday, to be sure that when you reconstruct fire in the past, to be sure that you have exactly the fire frequency or the fire return interval. I think that I repeat, it's a tool to try to see the fire through times. But we need to keep in mind that in one peak, we can have one or several fire episodes. Okay. Even if it's not an easy task to use charcoal to infer past fire activity, we go ahead. Because if you want to have a long-term fire history, I think that using charcoal from lacusine deposits corresponds to the best proxy now we have to deal with this topic. So, we made a kind of synthesis for the eastern part of Quebec using charcoal, but also using a new tools that help us to have the fire size. I not give you the detail of the technique, but just trust me. So we use this new technique, and the main point that we have kind of main information about the fire activity in the eastern part of Quebec is through time you have, you know, this graph in above, you have a decrease through times. So this is the time here. You have a decrease of fire frequency during the Holocene in this part of Quebec. This decrease of fire frequency is related to a decrease of fire season length. Over time, this corresponds to a decrease of installations and also an increase of precipitations. So, in this eastern part of Quebec, we have 3,000 years ago, a period, the name is Neoglacials, that we have a decrease of fire activity related to increase of precipitation, also related to a decrease of fire season length. But with this tool of fire size, we see an increase of fire size. So, decrease of fire frequency, because increase of precipitation and decrease of fire season length, but an increase of fire size. Why? We also see the temperature. So normally the annual temperature have a decrease also in the annual temperature, but we have seen an increase of spring temperature. And we make this kind of correlation, and we see that this curve of increase of fire size is significantly correlated with this spring temperature. You see an increase of spring temperature. So why an increase of spring temperature induces an increase of fire size? So between the beginning of the Holocene and for example, during the medieval warming 1,000 years ago, you have a plus 1 degree during the spring. Check this graph. This corresponds to a period, the modern period, and here in the x-axis we have the temperature of June, and above you have the mean fire size. You see, when we are here, we have a threshold when just 1 degree during the spring induce a sharp increase of the mean fire size. So, we make a kind of demonstration about our paleo data that an increase of 1 degree of the spring temperature during June could increase a sharp decrease of the of the mean fire size. Why? Because this one is correspond to the big fire in the Fort McMurray. And during this big fire, you see the damage related to this fire. And during this fire, we have an exceptionally dry spring with early seasonal high storm. Because when we increase 1 degree during June, the highs in the soil go more rapidly. So fire is an accumulation of drought conditions. So if you have a early seasonal high storm, you accumulate dry condition, and at the end of the fire season, big fire occur. So with paleo data, we demonstrate that occur now in the boreal ecosystems. Yes. Now we just talk about climate, that climate is the main forcing of fire. Okay, but it's not only fire that could play a key role in boreal ecosystems. We have also vegetations. And with our colleague Martin Gerlin, we start to try to put in the model also climate but also vegetations, to see the interaction between climate and vegetations through times. We have also data in the north, in the coniferous forest, but also in the south, in the mixed, that we call the mixed boreal forest. So in this panel we see that I have shown you before, a decrease of fire frequency in the north. But when we deal with the south, in the mixed boreal forest, we don't have a decrease of fire frequency over time. But something very stable, but sometimes we can see a kind of increase at the end of the Holocene of this fire frequency in the south and the mixed boreal forest. Why? In the north, you have a decrease, and in the south, an increase or something very stable. So, questions. What's happening in the past? So, we have the decrease of insolation. We try also to reconstruct the drought severity, something that's very variable, but a decrease of this drought severity. But when you take in vegetations, we have something very interesting, because we develop a needle leaf index. This needle leaf index gives you the importance of conifer in the vegetations. So you use pollen between coniferous and mixed wood forest, and we develop this proxy correspond to the needle index that give you the importance of coniferous species in the landscape, and also the coniferous species very that develop during fire, also like Pinus banksiana and Picea marina. So when we see in the north the blue panel, we have something very stable, like that we see in this panel, but this one corresponds to modeling. So just check this panel. So we have something very stable using pollen. This corresponds to the percentage of pollen related to coniferous. So we have something very stable in the coniferous part, in the north part, and when we see here in the south part, we have an increase of this index. That indicates that we have more coniferous in the mixed wood boreal forest in the south. We use a model developed by Aurélie Terrier. This model also is a model of fire occurrences. This model is fed by climate data and also vegetations. And we put it in the model. What says the model? The model says in the north part, we don't have a change in the vegetations, just conifer, and we have this decrease of fire activity is the model. So when you take the model, you take paleo data, it's very close. But when we deal with the south landscape, the models say that if you just deal with the climate informations, normally we must see a decrease of fire activity. But if you include the changes that occur in vegetations, you have something like increase fire activity, or something very stable, not increase because you have the envelope of variation. So, but now we just see that vegetation could also, with a feedback, not control, but modulate the impact of climate in vegetation, in the impact of climate on fire activity. So here, a management strategy is to favor or make some kind of plantations of deciduous species that could play like a feedback on fire activity. This one is it's not easy to explain, but I will try. So this one corresponds to also the mixed boreal forest, is just to show you that it's not only climate only climate that could play a key role on vegetation and fire dynamics in the mixed wood boreal forest. This corresponds to two sites in the mixed wood boreal forest in Ontario, and this panel corresponds to pollen and vegetation dynamics developed in the exotic site, sandy site, very dry, and this one corresponds to a site very mesic with clay. And the most thing that you can see that in this exotic site, so 10,000 years ago, you have an increase of Pinus banksiana. In the exotic sites, it's not the case because Pinus banksiana is very low percentages, but you have something very stable with Picea. But the main thing is in both parts you have a decrease of Pinus strobus. Pinus strobus is a late species, late successional species, not adapted to fire. And the most thing very interesting in this study is we start in the two parts with Pinus strobus, and we have climate change, also change in fire activity, because fire also play a key role, because when we take this graph, you have an increase of fire return interval, so less fire, and when you have an increase of fire return interval, it corresponds to the period with a maximum of Pinus strobus in the vegetation. But that we see that the soil property could induce different trajectory in the vegetation. So we start with Pinus strobus in both sides. In one side we go with a vegetation dominated by Picea, and in the other side we have a vegetation dominated by Pinus banksiana, dry and mesic side, controlled by the soil property. This one is very also interesting. Something wrong up here. So this one is just to show you the impact of the fire size and severity through time in the vegetation trajectory. This one corresponds to that opening. The red line corresponds to the western part, and the blue line corresponds to the eastern part of Quebec. The main thing that we need to keep in mind that we have an increase of fire size 2,000 years ago, between 2,000 and 1,000 years ago, and this fire size, increase of fire size in a period of decrease of fire frequency, induce an increase of two species that indicate an opening of the landscape, is Pinus banksiana and Alnus. Okay? Because when we deal with boreal forest and fire in boreal forest, frequency is very important, but the fire size could be the most important parameter that control the vegetation trajectory. So, the main conclusion is, in the Canadian boreal forest, fire frequency and severity had changed over times, over the Holocene. That's the main question we have at the beginning. It's quite true. In response to climate oscillations. So we think that the current global warming will alter fire regime, notably if spring conditions change drastically. Vegetation composition will be also impacted, modulated by soil property and initial states. So forestry activity will be more in competition with fire for wood, scratch through. And mitigation strategy must take into account information from paleo data. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, for a very nice overview of all the topics we have been working with. You have been working with over the past decade, as you said. We'll have time for a few questions. So, please.
Adam, is it possible to think that there have been some surface fire in the past in the boreal forest of Canada?
Ask Gwen. the big issue with the surface fire you have seen is the quantity of charcoal in the sediment is very low. So if in an ecosystem you have both crown and surface fire, I think that now with the information that we have, the quantity of charcoal can give you this information. Pas de questions, tant mieux.
Well, I'm not very familiar with Canadian forests, but it was really interesting to hear that the size is more important than fire frequency. Can you maybe explain a bit more? What are the reasons behind that?
Because I think that boreal ecosystem is very adapted to fire. So for me, the frequency is fire. I think that could be very limited. But the frequency is fire is something very, for me, not very, it's not a problem for boreal ecosystems. But for fire science, we burn a large territory sometimes. And we have some species, if they don't have some semencier des individus qui permet de seeding. So this could be very problematic if you burn all the territory and you have the species like Abies balsamea or is need to have seeding very close to be able to re-invade the landscape. And also the fire size could burn also the organic layer, and this part of the system is very important because if you don't burn all the organic layer, for example, for Piscina Mariana, you need that the organic layer is not so important to be able to reinvade a site after a fire. So if you just burn a little bit this organic layer, and also this fire occurred during the spring, it's not so high temperature, so severe. The system is not viable. That's why I think that the severity is more important than the frequency. But we have this kind of discussion if it's not so convenient.
As the research from Igor pointed that in Sweden we have this decline in forest size and tendentially increase in the amount of fires occurring. Of course, there it's a little bit different with fire suppression. But do you see in Canada such similar trends in decrease of size and
have a kind of cross between the frequency and the size of fire. If you burn a lot, you don't have enough material after to burn that, so to make big fire. So we have a kind of threshold between the frequency and the size of fire. So you see, in the past, we have a decrease of fire activity and increase of fire size. Something that very complementary, but you cannot make a high fire frequency and also a big fire each time. I think that this system is close to the desert if we go in this kind of fire regime. High frequency, high severity, big fire, nothing to burn. So.
Okay. Cool. So we thank you, Adam, for a very exciting presentation. Thank you very much indeed for that. And we continue. The mic is so sensitive. I really feel a bit stressed. Yes, that's right. We're happy to have Christelle Elie with us. Christelle has extensive experience with the modeling of not just fire activity, but basically vegetation, and specifically fire vegetation feedbacks in different parts of the world. And today, I think we'll hear something about boreal forest.
Yes, but this
Surprise,
is not
surprise.
actually, I made a mistake. I mean, I said it was the good one, but it's not the good presentation.
Okay, so we're gonna get even better presentation in just in a second. Okay, that's right. So.
Sorry. Two, maybe, because I'm not sure I will do it. Should be I don't have any of that. Tu le vois? Je le vois pas. Oh, yes, this one. No, this one. But maybe it's easier for you. I would be it's the good one. And to change it can be there? No.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can
So
use
which
his,
microphone I should
Yes, he's that one.
Okay, so maybe that one.
Yes, it's the best.
Okay.
And here's
Okay, thank you very much. So good morning, everybody. So I will talk about modeling fire activity, and actually it will give some links with the first day talks we had from weather and fire weather index. So here actually it's the outline that I had suggested for that part of the work in Boreal. So the idea would be in 4 steps. First, the idea would be to have a kind of present-day fire hazard computation in the boreal forest and the Eurasian boreal forest, trying to do a little bit like we've done on the Canadian side, I would say. And then the idea would be to try to understand how was the past. So as Adam showed you and others, that with paleoecological studies we can go to have a view of the fire activity during the Holocene and climate and vegetation change. We also can imagine to apply some present-day computation, such as fire hazard, and try to adapt them for the past, and also then for the future. We could have some assessment. And the first 3 points are only climate and fire related connections. And the fourth point is more like trying to link or to implement vegetation impact as well, as it has changed through time. So the idea would be to use dynamic global vegetation model to perform analysis. So for the present day, as we heard the first day, we've been talking about the drought code or the monthly drought code. The idea is that in the 70s, the Canadian team developed a method that is called the Canadian Fire Weather Index method. And the idea is that they have been tested for, at the beginning it was 15 years, but they have kept on. They have tried to parameterize or calibrate a method in which someone, like the man that is there, that is a forester, would go every day at noon to collect weather data and the amount of rain over the last 24 hours. And he would try to ignite a fire, to light a fire. Of course, he would not let it burn, but he would decide that maybe after a few seconds or minutes, if it's okay, then he'd stop it. So it's a success, and he would take all the information from the fuel. It means moisture content. So they have developed that method in jack pine forest. So it would be their fuel reference, okay. And by doing this, they have developed empirical relationship, and those empirical relationships are now used in many countries and many different ecosystem types around the world. So if people are not very familiar with, they use standard equation that from the Canadian method, and they try to understand what is the relationship with what they see as computed index and fires that are really occurring, and they try to work on threshold from output of FWI, and others are developing or extend equations, such as in southern France in the Mediterranean region. We do have a lot of windy condition during summer. In France it's called the Mistral, the very strong wind, and usually fires that burn during those days are very, very large, and actually the FWI is not really well adapted for the very strong wind. So the French and the, I would say, South European colleagues have developed equations for those special windy days. So we can use the FWI like this, or we can adapt it, or we can work on it. This is the main point for the rest of the talk. So the way, I will go very quickly, but the way it works is that from noon condition about temperature, relative humidity, wind and rain, you simulate, in fact, moisture code from the top layer fuel. So the liter that where you do have the pine forest needle, I would say, the intermediate, I would say, decomposing layer of humus, and the very deep organic matter humus, I would say. And when you combine that is on the surface, that is in relationship, well, in contact with all the variables of the weather, and you combine that with the wind, you can assess the initial spread index, so the propagation rate, okay, of your fire. If you combine the next two codes that are just so below, so not really in contact with the air, but are still affected with, here it's any drop of rain, it's moisturing that. Here you need a little bit more rain because you have to complete, that layer must be moist to try to moisture this one, and this one it's even less affected, so you need heavy rain, such as almost 3 millimeters, so 3 liters per meter to moist that one. But if you combine this and this, which means if they are dry, it's really like a thick fuel bed that is available to burn. Then you've got the build-up index, so it's really the amount of fuel that is really available, not to ignite the fire, but to spread the fire. And then at the end, you've got the fire weather index, so the fire hazard that you can work with. But in fact, we can work with all the components of the FWI. And so the way Canada is doing is that as they have automatic climate station, they record at noon, and then they can automatically compute each of these codes and provide where they do not have climate data, they perform interpolation, but at the end they have aggregated information about the risk. So here is the fire weather index, and I could have selected any type of day, but I like this one because here you see a strange pattern, and it's exactly a high pressure blocking system that is really drying over that region, okay, in that July 2005. So what we have done is that we have started to so far to apply or to work on the Eurasian side. We needed to have the information on fire, and the idea is then to work with the climate data to see what's going on. So Dorian has performed his master degree second year with us, and he has been using the MODIS dataset. So here it's 1916, but actually he also implemented the 2017 data. So he retrieved the fire pixel from the burn area product of MODIS, and he has built a spatio-temporal gridded map. Okay, so it's just to show you. Here is the full cover, so you can have a black pixel that has burned several times even during that period of 15 years. But so here is the spread of the fire, I would say, and here you don't see the vegetation types or the big region, but for sure we don't know if we should use all the data, whatever the vegetation types, or if it would be easier for us and maybe for operational stuff that we would work with regional information. But this is things that we can talk about. And of course, he has been analyzing the interannual variability in terms of total area burn or the amount of the number of fire that he has recorded. We also analyze on a monthly and seasonal aspect what was going on. And so we found first, but I did not show a picture, that we had found a logical seasonal pattern with fire starting from the south when it starts to snow melting and drying a little bit, and you've got a kind of southern to northern wave of fires, and by the end of the summer, the summer or even the beginning of the fall, fire are just regressing back to the southern part. And the idea of Dorian for his master, it was so to grab this information, but because we needed the fire information, we could have used actually other fire database, okay? So this is also needed to be discussed, but the thing is, as the fire weather index that we are using, we would like to have the best temporal resolution. We needed daily data. So MODIS, it's a 500 meters resolution, spatial resolution, but it's a daily product as compared to finer spatial resolution that could be more accurate in terms of burn areas, but usually they are not on a daily basis. So this is the trade-off that we need to face. So Dorian, after having that database, was interested in trying to see if there are drivers that can explain those patterns on the annual, seasonal time step. So we've been making several multivariate analyses, and we combine the Julian dates of the fire ignition. So the fire ignition dates, we combine the total burn area of each ignition, okay? And we couple that with environmental variables such as vegetation types, topography, soil types, kind of human activity in terms of housing, I would say, and so on and so on. And we can find some interesting pattern in terms of, so sorry, it's in French because this master degree was in French and I just captured the figure, but here, for instance, it's the fire duration, the number of days the fire kept on spreading. You've got the burn area and you've got the Julian date that is there. So here you've got all what is moisture, so it's rainfall and relative humidity of those fire days when they have started, versus here you've got wind speed, okay, for instance, and you've got air temperature that are there. And all vegetation types and soil that are on that corner. So we could explain, I would say, almost a third of the variance that is included in the fire data set. And we also perform some canonical correspondence analysis, so many analyses. So after having that, I would say, fire database, we've been retrieving the ERA interim product. So here the resolution is very large, I would say, as compared to this, but still we do have daily data. And we've been computing I thought it would be in bold, okay, so I don't know if I've got the good version, but it's okay. Here we've been building computing the standard computation of the fire wind index that I've shown you. And we started to perform some statistical analysis with that to find the best explaining variables, so the FWI predictors and their threshold, to see if we can characterize those fire and fire regime. So the idea would be to try to work on the season length, the fire type, if we can make some distinction between surface fire and crown fires, because there are crown fires as well, but not mainly as many as surface one, and so on and so on. So this was the postdoc work from Cécile, and I said, unfortunately, I do not have figure to show you because she presented her work last year and I was not there, but I do not have a record of that. I'm sorry, not on my computer, so I have no maps or regressions result to show you. But the thing is that what we've done is that the standard computation and basic analysis did not show any significant relationship between observed fire from the Dorian set and FWI index, I mean on the daily, and we also even went back up to 60 days before the fire, because as I said, the first day, the DC, for instance, we were talking about that, about the MDC. The DC has a 52-day record, I would say, if you've got a heavy rain, and if you saturate that layer and you leave it like this and it will dry up again, it will take 52 days to be dry. So we decided that maybe we should have a moving temporal windows of 60 days starting back before the fire has occurred. And so then it was a little bit disappointed for Cécile, but she worked very hard, and she also worked on different manuscripts to be published. And she has to leave last February to go on another postdoc project in New Mexico on a totally different topic. So she's very busy. We've been waiting a little bit of time to make sure that maybe she could keep on, but in fact it seems that she won't be able. So the idea is that we will keep on with her, but on the side, I would say, and try to figure out why a priori those computations were not really showing interesting and significant results. The thing is that we are talking about mainly surface fire, and FWI developed by Canadian team. It's really related or based on fires that are crown fire. So the idea would be to take back the ERA interim, make sure that computation of FWI have been done properly, but I'm sure there were, And the thing is that we will, I propose to perform other statistical analysis. The first possibility is to use analysis such as the boosted regression tree, and it's a mix between regression and clustering. And by doing this, we should, even though the value found for each FWI index could be very low, okay, it does not prevent that a low value of those indices is related to a fire, as compared to the Canadian, where the value are certainly higher than what we could observe here. So the idea is that without any threshold that you are looking for, you don't have any idea of the value you are looking for, but that type of analysis would provide value where you can have fire or not fire. So this would be to work on a standard computation, okay? The other possibility would be to look inside the equation that have been performed, that developed from Canada, and actually to do some sensitivity analysis. So it means that there are some values threshold inside the equation that we could play with in terms of sensitivity analysis to see if lower values of this threshold could pop up better relationship or link or correlation with fire. So this is what I would then call that an adapted computation of FWI for a region boreal forest, and this is why I put a kind of star here just to make sure that it's not exactly the Canadian one, okay? So, because as soon as we do have, something that really show fires with a certain amount of values, of higher values of or good values of FWI index, then you can analyze and characterize the other variables of the fire regime, not just the Julian date and the burn area, but then you can work on the season length. So today we could do it by looking at those fires that we can record or monitor with remote sensing data. But if you want to go back to the past, it's quite difficult. And we've seen from Adam's presentation that we were able to retrieve the fire season length in the past. So this is the idea we want to keep on. So here you see that when you compute over the Canada the normal of the DC normals, which mean the means from 1921 to 2010, okay, you do have here the drought code. So from April, May, June to September, you see that there is a big difference over the season. And so if you look on the eastern side that we've been working mainly with, now we've got another point there, but mainly we've been working there, and this is what Adam showed you with paleoecological reconstruction. In fact, when you analyze the true fires that have been recorded by Canadian agencies, it appears that actually when DC is over 80 units, this is the day that are really accounting for the fire season. It's not just, okay, snow is starting to melt, then we can start computation, but in the past you won't know when the snow was really melting. So the idea is to use such kind of value. Here it's from the modern period, okay? And if you look at this, you also can have a look of, okay, over our region, so fire season and true fires really light or start when the DC is above 80, and actually the largest fire in the Canadian Agency database, the largest one are related with DC that are above 160. So this is why working on FWI index, and maybe we use the standard computation, but we will on the Eurasian side have likely very lower value, but this is fine. The idea is to find a threshold where you can start to compute or to take that into account. If you look at the western part of Canada, which is burning far more than in the east, okay, the season always starts with, fires start when DC is still above 80, but there are so many more fires, more numerous fire and larger fire. It seems that the DC there, it's really 300 units are really related with the largest fire in the west. So we could, here we distinguished two, I would say, regions. We could perform that with the different erosion region, because we do have Siberian vegetation, we do have different vegetation types. So here we also have, okay, you've got the forest that is here, but you also have like the herbs and trees, les prairies, the grasses ecosystem here. So we could adapt the FWI computation and use in the same way. And what we do then, when we do have that for the present, and we are quite confident with the things we do have, and we have so many fires that have been recorded in Eurasia, so that we can have independent data set to calibrate and to validate, because there are so many fires, we can pick up random fires to calibrate and others to validate our results. Then the idea is when to do what, as we've done on the Canadian side, it's to go back to the past. The idea would be to select the best FWI or FWI star adapted predictors, okay, from the things we've talking about just before. And the idea is to use GCM, so General Climate Model, that have been running for the Holocene, over the Holocene, I would say. And so we can have some few transient run, so they will be continuously providing climate data since 6,000, for instance, up to now. Or we will have not a transient continuous run, but we will have snapshots every 1,000 years, for instance. And this is what we've done actually for the Canadian side. And so the idea would be to compute FWI with, so there are some statistical process to go back to our daily data if we want, or we could also go to the monthly if we decide that the DC is still the good index, and that we could use monthly data. With the MDC, we could perform exactly the same thing that we for the computation for the past, and then we can compare general trend over the past as compared to today to see if there was some change climatically speaking, and we also can relate those changes in the FWI index with charcoal, for instance, and information that we have from reconstruction. And when I'm talking about DC, it's because it's there. And actually, when you work with climate models, they provide many information. But if we can work all together, the idea would be, I was very conservative, I was not very confident with, should I use also the wind or the relative humidity that can change over a day? So can you imagine over a month and even over a millennium to have a value that would be representative? I'm not sure if it's okay. So first I was very cautious, and so I said, okay, I have to at least pick up some values, some variables, otherwise I won't do nothing. So I decided to only use temperature and rain. I'm always looking for the green line. Okay, there. And this is the only index that record the dryness and so the fuel availability, whatever is the amount of fuel, but it's dryness, okay? And actually, it's a slow process relatively to the other ones that are in few days and less than a week. When you want to compare that with charcoal peaks that have a temporal resolution of several years, ideally one if it's laminated, but usually we go 10, 15, 20, a little bit more. So I think this was like the based on the scale of reaction from this index, this one was the slowest one. Okay, so this is what we've done. So it was just to, and then so we do a kind of cooking recipe to compute the data. So if we have many or several model, we do have to remove the internal bias of each model. So the idea is to compute anomalies. So it means, okay, you're computing for the, let's say, 6,000 years ago precipitation, and the model has also to provide a control period. And so the idea is always to compute anomalies using the control or comparing to the control of that model to remove that internal bias. So in fact, we are more talking in terms of rate of change or change as compared to true values reconstructed or simulated. And so the idea would be to perform that with the normals that we can compute on era interim or other product, okay? And then or we go with the MDC, for instance, and we can stop here and you even don't look at this, okay? We compute the MDC that will be recorded from temperature and precipitation value, and we can use this and compare with charcoal. Or we can try, as we've done before, to work up to the daily reconstructed the climate, and then you do need to have some distribution selection of time series. Depending on the variable, you won't select the same distribution, but you do have the mean and the variability, so it's fine. And then you use a weather generator. It's not very good and efficient, but it's the bias inside the weather generator will be applied, and it will be the same for all periods that we will compare. So it's not a bias anymore, okay? And then if you compute the DC, for instance, then you can go with the fire season length and fire season severity as we perform in the present day. So just as you've seen, it was actually no, there are two pieces. Oh, yeah, okay. It's I didn't know. I make some animation, but you've seen that picture or that figure from Adam talked just before me. And so here is the fire season. So here is the insolation. Okay, here are the temperature and precipitation in terms of anomaly as compared. So the control it's 0 BP based on those climate model. Okay, and so here is the fire season that we've been reconstructed. So those are the number of days that really define the fire season length. So you see that it has been decreasing toward the present day. It has to be 0 there. Well, not 0, but we've got something like 130 days describing the fire season lengths today, and it has been far longer before. And that far longer before, we even can say if it was like an early spring or a late summer. And in fact, you see that here that we've been changing the summer end. Okay. And so we can relate those trends with the fire frequency or the fire size index that Adam has developed from charcoal. And so if we have climate data and climate model, we can perform exactly the same for future assessment as we performed in the past, except that we won't have things to compare with. But still, we can provide maps of fire risk. Okay, so this was exactly the same. And you remember how we had 4 parts of the work we wanted to do. So this was up to now only related to relating fire and climate, as it's likely a way to be more operational or provide information to stakeholders, but we also are able to use such vegetation models to try to figure out what are the trends in the past, present or future. And this has been the work from Emmeline Charles, so I would not like, and I thought at the beginning I would not present her result because she is defending her PhD thesis next week, so please you could join her presentation via video conference facilities. So let me know if you are interested. For those that will not be in Quebec or France, because otherwise it's really easy, it's next Tuesday. So our main research topic, or the main topic, was trying to assess the potential effect of climate change on vegetation and fire dynamics, and to characterize their combined effect on the eastern Canadian boreal forest, north and south of the managed forest northern limit that is here. Okay, so the idea with DGEM is that they are combining, that they are allowing us to understand what is this relationship, and of course nowadays with forestry industries and management, there is a kind of maybe not a competition between logging and fires, but the fact that fires could burn before people have succeeded to log. 5 minutes? What was it? 5, 2, 1? Okay. So let's go quick. The idea is that she has been developing or calibrating the model with a first chapter where she has been working on the current period. She has been working in the past up to 6,000 years, and she has been using climate scenarios to go to the end of the 21st centuries. She had several questions. First was to calibrate the model for the Canadian side, analyzing the relationship between fire and vegetation, trying to only produce prediction for the future, and use past information and run to try to validate the use of the model. Here is the model, so I won't go in, but you've got input data set describing environmental constraint, climate, and plant functional types that she has been working very hard on to calibrate them and parameterize them. Then you've got ecophysiological, I would say, processes, photosynthesis, respiration, and so on, allocation. You've got disturbance. Here is all the fire and all the variables that are taken into account and simulated. And by the end, you've got many information that you can retrieve from the model. You can have biomass, you can have LAI, you can have productivity, burn area, and so on and so on. So here was the calibration. So she went up to almost the genus you see of the species that are taking place in the Canadian side. So it's quite good. And just to show you the future results, so she has been using 2 RCP scenarios, 2 sets of GCM, and 2 regional climate models. So she has an ensemble of 6 climate scenarios. Temperature is going up the range, an increase that is far above, I would say, 2 degrees with that worst scenario. And in terms of precipitation, it should be overall on an annual basis, it should be an increase in precipitation. If you do an independent, so let's say you use those values and you run the monthly drought code as we've seen from July, you see that through time and with both RCP, you will have an increase in fire hazard only based with climatic data. So we should have more fire as if you only look at climate. But if you run the model, so not with this, with only those data and the vegetation information, at the end, so now time is like this, so here is the end of the centuries, you've got a gradient from, let's say, blue to red. Blue, it's a very small increase and you've got up to a high increase. And you see that if you synthesize both scenarios and all, this is what you do have. So in fact, you have almost a decrease in fires, except in that northern part, okay? And you've got a gradient that, with the reduction that it's even more important in the southern part. So it's a little bit curious because it goes against what climate and MDC was showing. If you look at biomass, you see that biomass, in fact, in the future will decrease, or zero, okay? So the idea is that it looks weird because, well, it looks weird, and in fact we discovered that, and I will finish with this, is that, okay, we have some mills region here, so we've been focusing on that. And what we see is that, so there is a kind of gradient in the future with a change from east to, so from west to east and south to north, okay? So if you take these two extreme region, what we see is that, okay, those are the fire. You see that, okay, they will keep on, but they will be far reduced after. The idea is that even though we've got an increase in establishment due to more good condition, we do have a trick over finally that decrease. Why? Because we discovered that we would have heat mortality. So drought, that we kill trees. So at the end, climate will be tougher for vegetation, okay, in terms of that mortality, which at the end should produce less fire than now. So it's how we link, when we link vegetation dynamics and response feedback on fire and climate effect on fire and vegetation, the story is not as straight forward than we could imagine just looking at climate data. And I think it's very important to take this into account. And I finished. Yeah. And here's the team. So you've seen student and PhD, and here are the guys, and even the discussion that we started. And so here are the team. Thank you. Sorry, I was late.
Thank you, Christelle. I think we just to keep in line, or try to keep in line with the schedule, we probably skip the questions. Right? Yes, we do. Sorry. And then we'll just continue for another presentation. We move towards the European part of the boreal forest from the Canada, and we go with the presentation of Thomas Sakala. In the program that you probably saw Pierre. Well, Pierre, we had the immense pleasure of hearing Pierre at the first day of the presentation, of the meeting, so I hope you wouldn't mind. We'll skip him for now. That's good. So, thanks.
Okay, so thanks, Igor. Well, my title is a little different from what it was in the program. So it's essentially tree-ring-based forest fire history reconstruction, where I then just throw a little bit of soil characteristics in the mix at the end. But okay, so just to kind of recap, we go from the standard blazing crown fires in Canada to northern Fennoscandia, where we have the surface fires, but we also have the crown fires. So it's a mixed severity fire regimes. And I think so far, the day before yesterday and today, we've kind of established that climate is important. So now we go sort of look at more smaller scale things. So if we have forests within the same climatic area, then what happens with the forest fires? And these are sometimes called bottom-up controls of fire currents as compared to the top-down controls from climate. And these bottom-up controls then caused this sort of much smaller scale variation than what we see in the to that caused by the climate. And we know from past studies that the landscape structure, the topography, or the fire breaks, lakes, and peatlands, and so on, they influence fire occurrence. The ignitions, especially human activities in northern Fennoscandia, influence, and then vegetation has an impact. So in this region, you often hear people talk about that certain vegetation types or tree species communities are more prone to fire because of differences in fuel load and fuel quality, especially between spruce and pine forests. But then from successional theories, we also know that fire history influences vegetation. So what the result is that the pine forests burn more often because pine forests burn more often. So to get around this problem a little bit, I wanted to look at how, or if we can see the influence of soil hydraulics within these fire history reconstructions. So the soil link comes then afterwards. Then another issue here is in these northern forests that are sometimes, in Finland, they're sometimes called subarctic forests. In their dynamics, the role of temperature is emphasized really heavily. And so I wanted to also see what is the impact of fire in sort of if we can see the influence of fire in the forest structures of today. Okay, so the study areas are quite far up north, a little bit of south from Gwenaelle's sites. So I did fire history reconstructions in 3 small areas that were located in these Varjo and Maltio strict nature reserves. So the distance between So the distance between these 2 areas is about 2 kilometers, and then there's one maybe 60 kilometers away. But so climatically in very similar area. And they're characterized by this kind of mosaic between open mires, forests, these small mountains or fells, landscape mosaic. So what I did for the sampling is that I took an area of 4 square kilometers and then sort of randomly located 16 sample plots. And then sampled for fire scars around each point at about 50-meter radius. Or if no fire scars, then looked at the age of the oldest non-fireproof tree species, so essentially spruce or birch that usually don't leave scars but are killed by fires. And then I added soil information by taking soil cores and looking at the particle size distribution and the stoniness to determine the soil field capacity. So essentially how much water the soil can retain when it's kind of full of water. So this is the first of these 3 areas, 4 square kilometer areas. It's a pine-dominated forest. And in this graph, what you see, this is each site. One line represents each site, so there are multiple trees within each site. And then the sort of red crosses are fires on those sites. And so we see, this is then the kind of composite chronology that shows all the fires that we found from this landscape. And we see a number of fires beginning from the 1600, but it's mostly has to do with the length of the record. So most of these sites are recording fires only for since the early 17th century or so on. But if you look at how these fires were then distributed in space, this is just a very rough approach to sort of illustrate what it means in terms of surface area when there was a fire. So most of the fires were kind of influencing just small parts of the area, or at least there was a fire scar from that fire only in a small part of the area. But then we also had these fires especially in 1751, 1800, and 1831, and to some extent in 1917, that influenced the entire area, or at least almost most of the area. So both kind of sporadic fires, but then years with when most of the area burned. Just 2 kilometers away, we have a spruce-dominated area, and now the time span that we're looking at is much shorter, and we only saw 2 fires there in year 1700 and 1831, and they influenced only a few of these sites in the sort of northern part of the study area. But most part of the area had not burned during at least the 300-year period that we could sort of reliably look at. And then the third area is a kind of a pine-spruce mixture, and the mixture is very similar to what we saw yesterday in the excursion. So it's a pine overstory with spruce coming in from below. And here we have a similarly long fire record as in the pine-dominated site. The difference being that most of these fires only influenced a small part of the area, and only the year 1777 had a fire that influenced most of the area. So kind of geographically small area and big differences in how the fires had occurred. If we then look at the kind of the overall statistics, so the fire cycles computed for the past 300 years, where we have a good record for all 3 areas, varied from 72 years in the pine-dominated area to 579 years in the spruce-dominated area. And the thing is that the distance between this and this area is 2 kilometers. So I can kind of, if Gwen is trying to match the fire scars from tree ring dates with the charcoal in the sediment, so if your source area is just a little bit different, the kind of the fire history can have like huge differences. Another interesting thing is that if we look at the change in the fire cycle, so in this graph, there's like a fire cycle computed for the 100-year intervals, like a running thing. And what we see in these 2 areas that burnt often, it's this Hirvaskangas and Hongikovara in this graph, so the pine-dominated forest and the pine-spruce mixture. So we see that the kind of the cessation of fires that we see in Fennoscandia, even if the distance between these 2 areas is only about 60 kilometers, the change in the fire occurrence occurred at a very different time. So in this Hongikovara area, the fire cycle started to dramatically increase already at the 18th century, whereas in this pine-dominated area, it's still, or the fires ended maybe in the early 20th century. So 60 kilometer difference, but the change in the fire cycle happened at a very different time. And I think this probably has to do a lot with the human activities and people messing around and igniting fires in the landscape. But just to illustrate kind of the small scale differences that you can have in the fire regime. So when looking at the climatic factors, you really need a larger area to filter out this influence. And so finally, to get into that soil stuff, so here on the y-axis we have the field capacity of the soil, so how much water in millimeters the soil column can hold. So essentially the higher we are on the y-axis, the more water there is. And then how many fires did a site record in the past 300 years? And we see a really clear change, or clear difference. If there was 0 fires, it was more likely that the site had a high field capacity. Whereas if you had multiple fires, more than 3 fires in the past 300 years, only sites with a very low water holding capacity would record such a large number of fires. So again, considering or reflecting with the paleoecology, maybe the sort of landscape composition or the kind of soil variability in the landscape also influences what you can find them in the lake sediments. One consequence regarding fire history is that at least in Finland, most of the fire history reconstructions that have been done are kind of done in locations where the scientists know in advance that there are fire scars, so it makes sense to go do a fire history there. But if you omit these sites and you only focus on these pine-dominated sites with fire scars, on a landscape scale, you really overestimate the role of fire in the ecology of these forests, if you have variation in soils in these areas. So to get a landscape representative fire scar, you also need to somehow consider the sites that don't bear any marks of the fire. And this has been a bit of an issue in the past fire history studies in Finland. So just to illustrate that the average field capacity of sites that didn't have fire scars was 82 millimeters, and most of these sites had zero. Had zero fire scars. But then, if you look at the average of the whole data set, it was much lower, and there you had the fires. Okay, then the sort of ecological importance of fire in these landscapes. So this map is from a paper in 1912, and they looked at the regeneration of pine forests around Lake Inari. So Gwenal's sites are somewhere in this region, and the green color means that there was a pine seed year every 10 to 20 years, whereas in the yellow areas, the sort of the conclusion was that there's a seed year only every 100 years or so, and it was attributed to topography and then the lake effect. And how it was done, it was by looking at age structures of trees, and it's still kind of a wide-held belief that the forest regeneration and the dynamics are associated with climate here, because warm temperature promote pine regeneration. And the connection between tree age structures and forest fires is much less emphasized, and the importance is that the implications of changing fire regimes are very different from if it is controlled by climate change. So the fire regime already changed more than 100 years ago, and we're now seeing the changes in the temperature. But if you look at the landscape scale age distribution of trees in these landscapes, so each line in this graph is an individual tree. So we have about 500-600 trees with ages from each landscape, and this is the pine-dominated landscape with many fires. We had the big fires in 1751, 1831, and 1917, and we can see the effect of those fires really clearly in the age structures. So we have these big cohorts recruiting after each of these large fires. In the pine-spruce mixture, the third landscape, where we had this big fire in 1777 and likely also in 1600, but then a sort of a cessation of fires earlier compared to this landscape. We have two really big cohorts that are again associated with the occurrence of these larger fires. And then we have this spruce-dominated forest with not so much fire influence, so also the age structure looks very different. Maybe the 1831 fire, it does have some kind of a cohort coming afterwards. But the thing is that if we lose fires in this landscape, So for instance, in this pine-dominated landscape, after the last big fire, how the age structure has developed is kind of turned into something similar to this spruce-dominated landscape that is without fire. So you have a major change in forest structures if you remove the fire. And at least, and then if it was caused by climate, we would expect these cohorts to be to occur at similar times, but they are separated in time. So I think that's another thing that speaks in favor of fire as a determinant of the forest dynamics and forest structure, also in these very northern forests. Okay, that's quickly what I wanted to say. Thanks to you.
Thank you, Thomas. I think that's another presentation which challenges the current methods used to reconstruct stuff, and like the standards which was supposed to be stable and something we can rely to, but ultimately we are going into something which we question and really modify for better representation of the past. We do have time for a few questions, so please.
Thank you. Just in your last slide, in the site in the middle, sorry, the slide before. Yeah, this one. There is a cut also in the middle, the middle side. There is another cut here.
Yeah.
And do you know if there is any explication?
No, I don't know. It's Norway spruce regeneration mostly at that time. But I no proper explanation for that. It was not fire, you know for sure that the trees on sites where we have these trees. We also have very old spruces there, so I'm pretty sure it was not a fire, but something else. There's also a very sort of cold period in the early 20th century, so it could also be could have to do with climate and then the seed years after the cold period. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Did you found spruce regeneration in 30s of 20th century in this region?
I did not look at that specifically. Well, the data is there, so it could be looked at, but I don't know. Why 30? There's a.
30s, I found regeneration of spruce.
Okay.
30s it was 20s.
Okay.
Thank you. It was interesting. And have you got any ideas how you can explain the difference with the rate of forest fires on your case studied areas? Because we are the distance between these areas is not so much, is not big, about 20 kilometers you said, yes? And maybe there is a clear natural characteristic which you can explain the difference with the forest fire rates. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So for between these two landscapes, it's about 2 kilometers only, and there is a big difference in the soils there. So most of the sort of soils with large water holding capacity are in these spruce dominated areas. But then it's a little bit more difficult to explain the difference between these two. It's about 60 kilometers, but and both are pine dominated. But there I would say that the landscape structure, in terms of how attractive they are to people, could be an important factor. So here, in this landscape, we have a very beautiful small lake in the middle. It makes a perfect campsite for hunters. And whereas on this one, it's much more difficult place to reach. There is a mire that is on this angle, so it's very not so nice to walk. So I think humans might be an explanation there. And we have some archaeological evidence, like old bear traps in this area. So there's certainly a long-term human presence in there.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes. So to simplify, when it's clay soil and spruce dominated, there are no fires, or hardly any fires. Yes.
Yeah.
And when it's sandy soil, pine covered, there are more fires.
Yes.
Okay. Do you think the dominance of spruce is because there have been no fires, or is the lack of fires because of dominance of spruce?
Yeah. Well, I can't answer that.
Okay. It comes up in my presentation in a few minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then I won't spoil it. Sorry.
Okay, fantastic. I think with that we thank you, Thomas, for very inspiring presentation and some interesting points on the methodology we really often use to reconstruct fires using the endocrinological method. And I propose we actually make not a fire break, which is what I'm saying. We're going to make a coffee break. We're going to make a coffee break for about 15 minutes, and then we follow the program afterwards. Right. And I do encourage you to join the discussion, and especially talk to Christelle, who, unlucky enough, didn't have a chance to really answer to your questions. Thank you.
Ok, moi j'ai fait moi-même au début. J'ai pensé 25, mais j'ai parlé.
On a l'impression que ça fait plus fort. Parce que, par exemple, oui.
C'était comme inverse 100%
c'est ça.
par rapport à tout que
C'est fou quoi.
Oui. Est-ce que c'est déjà publié?
Alors, le futur.
шанс покупать самолет, но нет поездов. Нет. 16. Тогда. Так бери билет тогда. А он не может поехать. Я вообще без аккаунта через РЖД покупаю. Ну а это без аккаунта покупать? Ты без аккаунта. Без аккаунта просто не будет.
Когда вы нажимаете «Купить билет», он автоматически бросает до последующей регистрации. Вы должны пройти, так нельзя начать.
Я покупал, да. Теперь уже так?
tu te gardes proche.
Ah, mais moi je fais pas ça. Moi je fais pas ça. Je me rapproche un petit peu.
Okay, so I invite all of you guys to come back and enjoy the rest of the session. So, welcome back. We start our last segment of the last day of the conference. Not let get sentimental on that, but just continue with the study presented by Jeanne Portier. That was her PhD project, and it wasn't her PhD project. Yes. So, but it was about extremes, and I believe that would be extremely interesting to listen to it. Jeanne.
Thank you, Igor. Yeah, so it's a work I've done in collaboration with Martin Girardin, Cécile Rémy, Adam Ali, Sylvie Gauthier, and Yves Bergeron. And it's about extreme wildfire events in eastern Canada, and two events in particular. So the last decade, as you may know, has been a bit crazy in terms of wildfire activity across the whole boreal biome. For example, like as Former talked about Tuesday, the historic wildfire outbreaks in Sweden in 2018, well, this summer. 2017 was the worst year on record in British Columbia in Canada. 2016, the Fort McMurray wildfire that caused the evacuations of thousands of people. 2013, in northern Quebec, also massive wildfires. And 2010, like a million of hectares burned in Russia. So this has been partly a consequence of drought conditions, and also it's been shown that the fire season length has already increased by on average 3.8 days per decade in North America between 1979 and 2015. And in the future, so here we see the expected changes in temperature and precipitation, the horizon 2050. And what has been shown is that there will be a higher frequency of extreme fire weather days. And actually what this study showed is that any increase in precipitation won't be able to compensate for the increase in temperature. And this will have repercussions in terms of fire suppression. The number of escaped fires is really expected to increase. And so here you see kind of the percentage of change in the expected number of days where a fire will be able to grow easily. So that means an increasing amount of financial and human resources to face the future fire activity, which might not be able to be, which fire suppression agencies' capacity might not be able to face. And at the moment, it's still kind of manageable because this kind of crazy wildfire events are occurring regionally. So there's a huge national and international collaboration to help regions experience the fire events. But in the future, we might get, because of the higher temperature, a synchronization of these extreme wildfire events that might be problematic for the fire suppression. So here we've used paleoecology to look for signs of this kind of synchronization in extreme fire events and to try to better anticipate what's going to happen in the future. So we have 42 lakes from 14 different studies, and from the fire, from the lake sediments, so it's Cécile Rémy did this part of the work. She was able to reconstruct kind of the fire history for the Holocene, and especially to extract the charcoal accumulation for each lake. And so we've normalized this charcoal accumulation to be able to compare the lakes, and we use this as a proxy for the biomass burning. So the more charcoal accumulation you have, the more biomass burning you have. And from this, we've done a special temporal analysis of this biomass burning. So, well, this thing here is supposed to represent the lakes on the map. And so the first thing we've done from this distribution of charcoal accumulation, we've smoothed this distribution to have to have more like a large scale trend, temporal trend. And we've extracted the value of charcoal accumulation for each 100 years over the Holocene. So we have one value every 100 years for each lake. And on this, we've done kriging analysis. So what the kriging does is that it takes the points on the map, and then you apply a grid on the points. So it's here a 0.5 per 0.5 decimal degrees resolution grid. And the kriging interpolates the value of the points to the grid. So then you have a full spatial coverage of your charcoal accumulation and biomass burning. So we've done that for each 100 years. So then we have one map or one grid every 100 years. And we've taken the mean value of all the pixels of each grid. So then we have one mean value of charcoal accumulation for each 100 years, and this is the advantage of averaging the pixels and not the lakes, is that you don't have an over-representation of an area where you have more lakes, for example. And then we've reported these mean values on a time axis, and then you get the temporal distribution. Oh. This is not working. Okay, so that was supposed to be a GIF with a map, with the charcoal representation, the biomass burning representation. So, okay. Well, what the map showed is that the biomass burning was increasing after the retreat of the glacier towards the north. So, if you can imagine our study area, the glacier was retreating this way, and then we had more biomass burning going this way through time too. And the special variability that we saw on the map, so the map was there, you would see that it's burning more in the north than in the south until about 2000 years before present. And we kind of explained this spatial variability by climate and vegetation. So, okay. So from 8,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago, in the north, well, there was more conifer species in the north than in the south, and also the summer precipitation were lower in the north, and this kind of explains why there were more fires in the north. And after 2000, the precipitation increased a little bit in the north and decreased in the south. The proportion of conifer species increased in the south, as Adam was explaining earlier. And this kind of explained why there was kind of a homogenization of the biomass burning on the whole area. And this is the temporal results of the biomass burning. So the continuous line is the smoothed distribution, and the dashed line is the unsmoothed distribution. And what we found really interesting was these two peaks of really high biomass burning at 4,800 and 1,100 years before present. And we tried to explain these two peaks, and when we looked at the reconstructed Greenland temperatures, we found that there was quite a good correlation between temperatures and this charcoal accumulation. And in particular, this one here was quite a high positive temperature anomaly. And yeah. But what's also interesting is that these two different extreme wildfire events were happening in two different configurations. So if the first peak occurred while the climate was warm but very dry, and the other one, the climate was even warmer but more humid. And this means that in these two cases, temperatures were really high, and whatever the level of precipitation, this high temperature led to extreme fire activity. And well, the conclusion of this is that if this is similar to what we are facing in the future, to the future climate condition, if we reach these values of high temperature, whatever the changes in precipitation, we might get some really extreme wildfire activity. Thank you. Sorry for the map.
Thank you, Jean. Questions?
Yeah, thank you. So, what I was wondering, you reconstruct the mean temperatures, so changes in the mean, but changes in the mean don't necessarily reflect change in the extremes. I was wondering if there is any research on that. So it's probably a very difficult question, and very difficult to reconstruct from the reconstructions you have. But towards future climate, the extremes react. The tails in the distributions react much more strongly to warming than the mean. So the mean shifts a bit, but the extremes shift much more, and so you can have maybe difficult to explain, but I was wondering if somebody looked at it before, what the extremes do in such cases, and not necessarily the mean. So that, well.
Yeah, well, it's always a question of scales, really. Here it's these temperature reconstructions were from melting ice in Greenland. So it's not really mean. It is mean, but it's still quite. I think it's quite accurate. And at these time scales, we can call these peaks like temperature anomalies, which is quite. I don't know. It's one time, and even if this is like kind of representing the mean, it's still like anomalies that are not. It's not a long-term trend. It's still an event, like an extreme event that we link to this extreme wildfire event. So it's, I mean, if in the future we are going towards a mean that represents an extreme event in the past, it's even worse. But yeah, I'm not a climatologist, so I don't know how to.
I think that the most important information that we can see about this reconstruction is for the past, globally, around 4,000 years ago, the climate is globally in North America warm and dry, and after the climate became warm and mostly humid. So if globally the climate is warm and dry, it's quite easy to see, okay, to say it's quite normal to have high biomass burning in these configurations. I think that the second increase of charcoal accumulation occurred during a period with warm and humid conditions. It's not so easy to make a link between climate and fire activity, but here I think that extreme conditions is related to this second peak accumulation, because we can say, okay, globally the climate is humid and you can accumulate biomass because globally the fire activity is not so high because you have a decrease of fire activity, but sometimes we have severe dry conditions that could generate this type of anomaly and increase of biomass burning during this condition. So for me, the second peak corresponds mostly to extreme events during the medieval warming. That's why I think that the last 2,000 years could be very a beautiful period to check this variability in climate, because we have a lot of oscillation between cold, warm, dry, and very the climate is not stable. That's why I think that this kind of condition with extreme condition will be very important to reconstruct during this last 2,000 years.
Just in connection to this, we have been discussing so much the mean values, so I thought maybe I should just ask a mean question. Okay, so my question is, you have been reconstructing the biomass burning using charcoal data, and before this presentation we heard a presentation by Adam about the intricacies and difficulties to actually come up with understanding what actually does this record represent. Is it the local event, which is smaller but just brings more sediment, more charcoal into the record, or it's a very large event which is maybe not extremely local, but it's still recorded pretty well in the lake, right? So there's an issue how to scale things up or down. So in this context, do you think this would compromise the conclusions which you came up with now, or they're still solid?
I think it's still solid, because there's two things. First, it's we're not looking at one lake, we're looking at 42, like quite well distributed, and so then you can both kind of capture what's happening in locally, and also what's happening, like if there is one event between two lakes, the two lakes might be able to capture this fire and also the local ones. So I think we kind of,
still trust.
Yeah.
Results.
Well, it's also like these kind of peaks are so high that, clearly there is a high fire activity, and yeah.
Good. Well, that's excellent news.
I understand you have a lot of lakes, but in the subdomain I presented in my presentation, we can see a good, an evident transition between the ipsithermal period and the neoglacial period, close to 2,000 and 4,000 years ago. But on your results, we don't see this transition. And do you have some explanation about that?
Well, maybe it's just because we're looking at the really bigger area, so it might just be kind of hidden in the averaging of. And again, this is charcoal accumulation, but when we also did fire return interval reconstruction, and the curve is not exactly following the biomass burning, and so maybe this is, some things can be explained by vegetation more than by climate, or it's again this fire frequency versus fire size. So.
But is in some of your lakes you see a transition between boreal forests with temperate species and after that boreal species mainly? How do you understand your vegetation about your lakes? Do you have a general idea of the main sketch of this vegetation?
Like this, where here?
What are the main synthesis element about the change in the vegetation of the lakes you studied?
Well, I think it's what Adam was explaining in his presentation, like this borealization. The increase in the conifer, the proportion of conifers in the landscape would lead to maybe larger fires, but then it also led afterwards to a decrease in the fire frequency because fires were large because the fuel was very flammable, and then this led to a decrease in fire frequency. So this is how the vegetation can modulate the distribution of fire size and fire occurrence.
Great. Well, thank you, Jean, again for a very instructive presentation.
See, that's a map.
Yes. Okay. And yes, everybody saw the map, so that's good. So now I would like to invite Heikki Seppä. Heikki has been working extensively in the boreal forest of Eurasia, mostly Northern Europe, and now covering a lot of topics concerning the long-term reconstruction and vegetation structure. So it will be very interesting to listen to Heikki and see what you have to say.
Yes, I will mostly focus on long-term trends, so Holocene to millennial scale trends in fire, climate and vegetation, and I pick some key points. I focus mostly on Scandinavia, but I also include Northwest Russia because I've done quite a lot of fieldwork here in the past. So first with some Holocene examples, and I've done over the last 50 years with my colleagues quite a lot of fieldwork in Russia as well. And the key questions here in Northwest Russia, from the Finland-Russian border up to Ural Mountains, have been things listed here. Basically, change in boreal forest structure in Northwest Russia associated not only with climate but also with disturbance dynamics, fire included. Especially here, we have a special ecotonal boundary. This is roughly where we are right now, a little east of Petrozavodsk, is the western range boundary of Siberia Large. So that's one thing we want to study in the past, the history of Siberia Large, associated with disturbance. Also, all these issues, climate disturbances, also interspecific competition, one big factor in forest dynamics. And basically using, in my case, charcoal records, polar records, tomato records from the lake sediments. So no really dendrochronological data in this case. So first I show by showing the results, I start by showing the results mostly based on the work done by former PhD student Nina Kuosmanen. So we did fieldwork here, we are right now here in Petrozavodsk, on the eastern side of Lake Onega and also on the western side of Lake Onega. And this hatched area here indicates the range limit of Larix sibirica, that's Siberia Large. So we want to study the history of migrational history, dispersal history of Siberia Large from many points of view, also associated with disturbance dynamics. What is the role of fire history in controlling the western range boundary of the Siberia Large? Here we are doing, in these figures, we are doing field work. There are some people from Petrosaurs included in this picture. For example, this is, I think, Oleg Kuznetsov, who probably works in this building. At least used to work in this building as well. And then my colleague Richard Bradshaw and me taking sediment records. Just picture of showing the sediment sites where we took the sediment. Now, we didn't use, or we used also lake sediments, but we also took samples, what we call the forest hollows, small hollows, peaty hollows, just inside the forest. And the reason is that the Siberian larch, those of you who know pollen know that the larch is a difficult species from the point of view of pollen work. It's a very low pollen producer, and pollen grains are very heavy. So if you take a sediment core from middle of the lake, you are very unlikely to find much large pollen because it's so heavy. So that's why we took this sediment core right in the middle of large stand, and we were looking for large pollen and also stomata, because it's a very prolific stomata producer. It's a deciduous coniferous species. It drops its needles every year. So this is, for example, one site where we took the sediment core right in the middle where the westernmost large trees are growing. And this is then the sediment core. You will immediately see that there are quite a number of charcoal layers in the sediment core. Just briefly, the results. These are the two key species, spruce, Baesia abies, and larch siberica. And this is basically almost the whole Holocene going back to nearly 10,000 years. The core right in the middle of the larynx stand. And these are the stomata records. This is spruce, and this is larynx. And when you look at the larynx stomata records, you can see it goes all the way back to 9,000 years. So our conclusion in this paper is that the larynx has been basically here, where it's right now at its western range margin, throughout the Holocene. There is no evidence for any migration westward in the Holocene, as is the case with spruce. So if I go back, it doesn't matter. Anyway, if you saw the map of larch, western range limit of larch, it's probably been there fairly stable over the last 10,000 years. That was one of the conclusions of this paper. We were also looking at the disturbance dynamics using pollen of spruce and birch, because for larynx the pollen are so few you cannot do any statistical test. Here we compare the pollen values of spruce and birch with the charcoal values indicating the fire activity in the Holocene. And this is a fairly simple statistical test, wavelet coherence test. It's a statistical way to test whether there's any correlation between the pollen values and charcoal in case of spruce and birch. And basically, when the arrows are pointing left, there's a negative correlation, anti-phase correlation, and when the arrows are pointing to the right, there's a positive correlation, in-phase correlation between charcoal and the pollen values. So at most time levels, this is a time level, it becomes longer, there are longer cycles and shorter cycles in the data. You can see that the birch is positively correlated with the charcoal values, and spruce is negatively correlated with charcoal values. So in this particular case, there is clearly evidence that, for example, if you look at this bird here with a low fire activity in the mid-Holocene, the spruce values tend to be higher. That's a visual interpretation, and the wavelet coherence interpretation is in line with the visual interpretation. This is one site. We had 4 sites, and I have to tell you that at all sites the results are not as clear as in this case. I just picked the clearest case as an example. Okay, let's then go to Scandinavia, a little west of here. And when we go to Scandinavia, one of the most interesting feature in the Holocene vegetation history is certainly the expansion of the spruce, which is indicated on this map. You can see roughly the timeline. 6,000 years ago, it's coming of course from the east, 5,000 here, 4,000 here, 2,000 here, and probably still expanding in some parts of Norway and in southern Sweden. And it's a very important, interesting tree species in the boreal forest in Europe. It's a very strong competitor. It's very shade tolerant, doesn't need much light, but it's very fire sensitive. So when there's no disturbance, it usually becomes the dominant species, but it's very sensitive to various types of disturbances, especially fires. So it's one of the key species to study, and we published this paper some time ago with Mikael Olsson and other colleagues, where we wanted to study was the expansion of spruce associated with changes in fire history. And I briefly explain what this figure indicates. These are charcoal profiles from different parts of Norway and Sweden, and this line here indicates when the spruce expansion in the polar records takes place. So if you look at this side, for example, right when the spruce expansion takes place, the charcoal values basically disappear. So we argued in the paper that there's a link between the spruce expansion history and the forest fires, so that when the spruce became the dominant species, the fire activity declined almost dramatically in these cases. You can see the same in these figures, which basically indicate the decline of fire activity if you compare the time before the spruce expansion and after the spruce expansion. Now this links to what Tuomas was discussing in his presentation, or I was discussing when I made my question. Is the spruce expansion in the mid-Holocene taking place because the fire activity declined and spruce was able to become dominant? Or is it vice versa, that spruce first became dominant, and because spruce influences the forest ecosystem, so then the fire activity declined? And when we tried to publish this paper, we had long discussions between each other and also with the reviewers. What is the consequence and what is the cause when we look at this kind of interactions between species expansion and fire history? And still ongoing discussion, because some people have a little different results in Scandinavia as regards the mid-Holocene expansion of spruce and changes in fire activity. Okay, when we come to late Holocene, that means basically the last 2, 3, 4,000 years, things become actually substantially different, because the human activity becomes more and more as one of the dominant factors in the forest history and fire history. So that's certainly a fact in Scandinavia. There also we've done collaboration with archaeologists who are providing more and more feasible estimates of past human population size in the Holocene. But we certainly can see a major population expansion, including, of course, agriculture. And when the agriculture started a few thousands of years ago, one prominent feature in agriculture was the use of slash and burn cultivation, which means cutting down the forest, burning it, and then using it for crop cultivation as a field. And certainly because the fire was associated, that had a major impact on forest structure. And there are lots of historical records which tell us about the slash and burn cultivation. Because it was practiced until early last century, so there are also fairly detailed historical accounts how it was done and where in Scandinavia. This is a quite famous painting in the main historical art museum in Helsinki, and it shows slash and burn cultivation taking place somewhere in eastern Finland. There are some interesting features. If you look at this painting, it shows, which is certainly true, that most of the slash and burn cultivation was done on the, if not the mountain, at least on hills, because these are traditionally the main agricultural or crop cultivation areas. We can see the use of fire, and we can be sure that the fire was not restricted to these areas, because it was impossible to control, or very difficult to control the fire once you started to use this kind of a way to cultivate crops. An excellent source published in 1915 about the historical slash and burn cultivation is the study by Olli Heikinheimo. It's a really interesting account, because he traveled this was still done, this published when this was still practiced. So he was able to discuss with the people, make maps, take photographs. Unfortunately, it was published in Finnish, so that's a little limitation. But I can tell you that it's a really useful account of slash and burn cultivation. This is obviously a historical map. Finland is a little bigger than it is now. But if you look at this map, you can see a temporal shift in the dominance of slash and burn cultivation. This is roughly 150 to 200 years ago, or 250 years ago, something like that. There's a shift eastward even in 1913, still in eastern part of what used to be Finland. I'm sure it must have continued at least all the way to Lake Onega here on the Russian side of the border. So it's historically fairly well documented way of influencing the forest by using the fire. Now, obviously, it's very interesting to use lake sediment studies to investigate the history of slash and burn cultivation. How well can we see this in the fire history, in the charcoal data, and how well can we see the impact of slash and burn cultivation by using, for example, pollen data on vegetation? So I start with this record. This is basically the outline for these questions, especially the combining charcoal and pollen to see the fire frequency and its impact on vegetation. And I start with this record. The yellow dots indicates it's from the center of the intense slash and burn cultivation area in eastern Finland, mostly work done by a colleague Aki Pitkänen, University of Eastern Finland. And what he and his colleagues did, they took a sediment core from this lake. It's a very small lake area. It's annually laminated, so there is no major dating problem. I'm focusing on late Holocene only because he wanted to study especially the slash and burn cultivation. And when you look at the results, they are very... it goes the other way. Oh, it goes through. Yes. This is a time scale. On the x-axis, year 2000, so present. This is year AD 500, so it's 1,500 years ago. And this is the proportion of spruce of pollen data. And first I have to tell that what Aki Pitkänen did, he used the correction fractions with pollen data. So the original spruce percentage of pollen is a little smaller because when you use the correction factors, the values become higher. So the idea is to have more realistic estimate of the proportion of spruce in the pollen data. But what you can see basically is this decline in spruce proportion starting from roughly year 1,500 and decline over here and then a rapid increase. When you look at the slash and burn evidence from charcoal, you can see that when the slash and burn cultivation started, roughly 500 years ago, it clearly had a major impact on forest composition, so that the spruce proportion went down distinctly. And then we can clearly see from the historical evidence, documents, when the slash and burn cultivation ended, late 19th century, so no more slash and burn cultivation, no more fires, and the spruce basically increases very rapidly over the last roughly 100 years, little over 100 years. So a major recovery of spruce population once the fires, intensive fires, ended in this area. Now we can, if you look at the other pollen types, we can see that when the spruce values declined because the slash and burn cultivation, the other curve indicates pinus pollen values, pine values, and we can certainly see that when spruce had its minimum here, pine was by far the dominant tree species because pine is much more fire tolerant than spruce, no doubt about that. So very clear evidence regarding the impact of slash and burn cultivation on forest composition in this case. Other example further south, but also in the slash and burn cultivation area, mostly done by a colleague Teija Alenius in Finland. So slash and burn cultivation, lake sediment core, analyzing charcoal and pollen to see the impact of slash and burn cultivation on fire vegetation history. And here is a summary record from Teija's work. This is again time scale. Now it goes the other way, calendar years before present. So this is nearly 2,000 years ago, and this is present. And this is a spruce pollen curve. Again, we see higher values roughly 1,000 years ago, declining here, and it's declining because the charcoal values go up. So we can again see the impact. We can see the beginning of slash and burn cultivation here. Humans start to use fire, and when the slash and burn cultivation begins, the spruce population declines again fairly dramatically, I would say. So the same feature as we saw in the previous record, we see the strong impact of slash and burn cultivation on forest structure, especially so that the spruce is the sensitive species declining during the peak of slash and burn cultivation. It's here. In this case, the spruce recovery after the end of slash and burn cultivation is not so clear as in the previous example, and we know why, because this is now a more sort of urbanized area. So there's lots of human forest management around this lake. It's not following the natural succession anymore, unlike the previous example. Okay, if we go back to Heikinheimo's work about the history of slash and burn cultivation, he has these figures which indicate how typical, sort of distinct the vegetation succession after the slash and burn cultivation of fires was in the boreal forest. So here is, on the left is a typical birch forest roughly 50 years after the end of slash and burn cultivation. So birch as a pioneer species was clearly the dominant species. In some cases, like here on the right, alder may have been also the first pioneering pioneer species in the post-fire success. But typically decidual stand, birch or alder stand. When time goes on, a change takes place, and this is a nice example of that. As you see, it's now completely spruce covered forest stand in Finland, but this site was protected in 1911, so 107 years ago, a small protected forest patch. And it was protected as an example of post-fire birch forest, because it was, I'm sure I can go back, but I have no idea what the Russian text means, so I don't want to click every. But you see that the birch stand after the fire, and this place was also a birch stand, completely birch covered in 1911 when it was protected, but the natural succession has made the spruce again a very dominant species in this case. So it's not the example of post-fire of Boston slash and burn birch forest anymore. It's now a totally spruce-dominated stand. So it shows how quickly spruce can become a dominant species and how the natural succession without the fire goes towards a dominance of spruce at most of the sites at least. So my conclusions, in many ways, if you look at the North European boreal forest dynamics in the past, spruce is the ecological keystone, as some people say, keystone species. And the natural succession, it usually becomes the dominant species. It's a very strong competitor, but it's a very sensitive species to disturbances. So it makes a very interesting study from the paleo point of view. Sensitive to fires, killed by fires, unlike pine. We have this major east to west expansion in spruce. In larix we don't have it, but with spruce we have it. But it still remains fairly poorly known. For example, the underlying reason for the spruce expansion, it's still debated. There's no single explanation for it, despite having been studied way over 100 years. Slash and burn cultivation is the very critical form of human impact in the history. What happens during the peak of slash and burn cultivation is the very strong decline of spruce population. And when then slash and burn cultivation ended, a little over 100 years ago, spruce has been recovering, and I would still argue that there has been at least over the last decades an ongoing spruce population increase in the former slash and burn cultivation areas in Northern Europe. Also, one prominent take-home message from this is that when we look for reference conditions for fire regime in the past, so the baseline fire reference conditions, if we go back in a few hundred years, like we can do using tree rings, for example, the problem is that was a period of intense human use of fire, slash and burn cultivation. So I would argue that using this slash and burn cultivation period for reference condition is misleading. We will get a picture about the fire regime, which was strongly human-induced, and anomalies in relation to natural fire regimes in the Holocene. Thank you.
Thank you, Heike. So, we have time for questions.
One question. We just deal with charcoal accumulations or influx. And I just wondered why we don't try to have fire events or fire dates with your charcoal accumulation, because sometimes you can see that you have a high charcoal accumulation, but it could be not related to increase of fire activity. You know, sometimes in lake you have high accumulation of charcoal during period with a decrease of fire activity, and we make this kind of interpretation that this increase of charcoal accumulation during a period of a decrease of fire frequency could be related to increase of fire size or severity, something like that.
Yeah, in my presentations, I didn't show all the data we have. So there are lots of different analyses of charcoal, including the particle size, particle diameter, and all this data basically exists. But I didn't have time to show all these analyses. So I wanted just to show the main trend. Yeah.
Okay. So you also try to have fire dates in the sequences, or just try to see the size of particle, or something about if you want to have fire return interval, for example, this kind of recording. I think that could be interesting to see the fire return.
Sure, you know, the fire dates, especially from the laminated sequences, you can exactly precisely, but there aren't that many of those. Then when we go further back in time, these are radiocarbon dated, they include a statistical error which you must take into account, so it becomes less precise. Can be done, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
You show on the one of the first pictures 4 points, A, B, C, D to the west from Onega Lake. And have you found large Larix sibirica on D point?
At this site, no. Only the sites where Larix is known.
Thank you.
Yes.
How do you explain the persistence of the large distribution limit in this region? Because I understood that despite the fact that climate has been probably changing quite a lot over the last 6,000-9,000 years, the larix was still there, though at different abundance, right? It's still there.
Yes. I have to keep in mind that we only have very few sites. So there may have been range dynamics, which we can track with such a low number of sites. So for example, the northwestern margin or northeastern margin, so northeastern or southwestern or northwestern margin may have changed in the past. So with very few dots, it's very difficult to say precisely. But because we know we are here in Petrosavodsk, this is outside the margin of Larix. And it was on the eastern side of Lake Onega 9,000 years ago. At least in this direction, it seems that there has been no major rate dynamics. But if we go 500 kilometers north, maybe there have been more changes, we don't know.
Yeah? Do you have more questions? No. people are exhausted. Okay, well, Heidi, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Yes. Okay, so if you have been reading the program carefully, we had something called panel discussion, but the reality is different. We are simply late and we still have to have lunch, and then the Russian version of this Russian component of this meeting, which will start at 2 o'clock. So I took the liberty to basically cancel this component. I hope you're not very angry upon that. And I think we could say it was quite lovely 3 days, and maybe you didn't have a chance to maybe speak everything you have to say, but at least some part of it. And I hope that we come up with certain ideas what to do in the future. We came up with ideas how to develop most important part of it, which is funding. We took a decision that we'll probably try to write another application, surprise, surprise. And we also have maybe a few words to say, and I think Adam can take the lead here. Just a few words about this EMI, the Unité de Recherche Mixte, right? Right, which is not really exactly the pre-real project, but it's very closely connected to what we're doing in pre-real, and which is good news. And then, we probably had some discussions which we kept within our small groups, and hopefully it will be very useful and instrumental for the rest of the project. Since it's the midterm, I feel we need to change a bit the way we have been handling the management. Specifically, we need to be more, spend more time updating each other on what's going on, because we are very close to the end, exactly 2 years still left to go. And I have been attending a meeting of this Belmont Forum in London just a couple of weeks ago, and what I learned is that there will be a proper evaluation process, and this evaluation process will define our chances to apply for more money in the future. And since we are very ambitious, and as Adam said, it's not very important to be consistent, but it's very important to be ambitious. I really like this point. We clearly won't want to compromise these chances. So I strongly encourage you to think about the output as is promised, and also output which can connect to the interests, to the added value which society can benefit from, right? We already have been discussing this during the steering group meeting, and I believe it's very important that everything you do, you kind of keep things in the background, this idea that this has to somehow benefit societies. Not necessarily in the country where you have been sampling, doing analysis, but probably at a much wider range, and providing some insight and some synthesis and new proxies and new parameterizations and things which advance our capacity to mitigate fires, which most likely will increase, despite the fact that we are supposed to head towards a new new ice age, according to the insulation ratio, which I spotted on your presentation now, but yet everything which we see recently suggests that that will be not exactly this dynamic. With this type of confusing message, I still want to give a few words to Adam, just to say about this unit, which I think is very important to.
Okay. This network is initially initiated by French institutions, the CNRS with the JDRI, and now we demonstrate with the Belmont funding, but also with the long experience with Canada and now with our partner, Russia partner, but also Scandinavia partner. The French institutions told me that they want to build an international lab, and with this international lab we want to put money, to put also some personnel, some technicians, some researchers, to deal with this big problematic of boreal forest ecosystem and the impact of climate change in this biome, and also how we can develop good strategy to sustainable activity, and also the way we can try to preserve these ecosystems. So now the following step is to create this international lab. Normally the two partners will be France and Canada, but we push also in the way that the different partners, Russia and Scandinavia partner, will be included in this international lab, with the way that student and also researcher could try to make this kind of network, also to try to be in connections inside the network, and to be more effective in research. So we have this kind of positive sign from the CNRS. So I will try to write this project, but also I need to visit the different institutions here in Russia, but also in Canada. In Canada it's quite easy because we know exactly what we will be involved in the project, but I need also to go in Scandinavia, in Finland, and in Norway, in Sweden, to visit the different partners that will be in this new lab, international lab, and to see if it could be very effective for them to be included in this big project.
Thanks, Adam. That's clearly a very big development. I wish all of us all the best with that. So with that, I would actually like to thank you for joining this, and I hope you enjoyed, or largely enjoyed. I hope it's, well, just enjoyed, but well, who knows, these 3 days. There's just two things I would like to say. One thing is that for those who won't be present at the Russian segment of this meeting, starting at 2 o'clock, there will be excursion organized by Nina in the afternoon. So, oh, Nadezhda, sorry, I do apologize. Nadezhda, that's right. So she will tell you a few words about that right in a second. Right, but in the meantime, there's another small piece of very technical information. We clearly would like to make a picture for all of us as a good memory of this event, and I believe we can do it right now and right here, right? And yeah, that's right. And with that, I just thank you very much again for attending and contributing, and looking forward for very close and productive cooperation in the months, weeks, let's talk about many scales, days, weeks, months, and years to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Dear colleagues, I have a very short announcement. According to the program of this meeting, we have prepared an excursion to abnormal wood collection. It is located upstairs at this building, and we are planning to start at maybe 2:30. We understand that maybe some of you prefer for sightseeing or some other activity, so I have only one question. do we have participants who would like to visit this collection? If so, I would like you, those of you who are going to come, raise a hand, please, just for me to understand the situation. Okay, so we have several people. So it's just for you several slides I show, it's not the whole presentation, and you will have a possibility to see and touch any of specimens you will be interested in, and I will try to answer your questions about woods, and we can discuss. So it is a program. So you are welcome, and see you after lunch. Is it okay if we will start at 2:30? Is it okay? Is it enough time? Okay, so I will see you. So maybe we can meet here. Is it okay? And then we will upstairs and continue our conversation. So thank you very much. See you.
Let's maybe occupy that place and make photo.